Well, that was exciting. I'm glad I got those out of the way. So we'll put this away and... oh yeah. I guess it's around that time that I got into this. So let's scratch this off the bucket list, shall we?
Dragon Warrior 1 was a game that I got at a flea market as a younger fellow decades ago, and that game was absorbing. I adored that game. The Old English, the swords, the sorcery, the monsters, all sorts of stuff in this fantasy world that engaged a younger mind. Dragon Warrior 2 was a rental from a video store one night, and that was pretty swell too. That same video store would also host the fourth title for rental, and that's a tale of its own. However, when it came to the third chapter in the NES tetralogy of localized Dragon Quest games, Dragon Warrior 3 was the one that had eluded me. It was the only one of the bunch that I never got to play as a kid, and it wasn't for a lack of trying either, because these games would be difficult to come across, especially as NES games started to fall on the wayside to make way for more current video games. It was only until a few years ago that I eventually was able to snag a genuine honest-to-goodness copy of Dragon Warrior 3 for NES, and yes, it did cost a pretty penny to get, because we've reached the point where Nintendo games were being treated like vintage comic books and gouged for ridiculous prices. It's part of the reason why I slowed on the game collecting thing over the years, because it's no longer about finding that lost gem to play, it's about sticking it in a display case or stuck in some shelf untouched and unloved, until you're ready to sell it on eBay because it went up in value or some shit like that, or possibly because there's a limited run re-release on the market. That is a discussion for another day, but I digress. Anyway, Dragon Warrior 3 originally released in Japan as Dragon Quest III Into the Legend or The Seeds of Salvation in 1988, before eventually getting localized in 1992, for fuck's sake, for the NES. They released 2 Dragon Quest games in 1992, localized. Anyways, third game has you assuming the role of a young hero whose gender you could select, only 2 at a time, sorry, and you've been bestowed a quest to carry on the quest that your father lost his life trying to accomplish, and that is to slay the evil archfiend known as Baramos. After getting your orders from the king, you move on to the, den, where you get to recruit up to 3 more members to your party. The center has 3 stock characters you can recruit, but you could go to the second floor and create other heroes to recruit, which involves giving them a name, a sex, and choosing from one of 6 job classes, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Soldier is your full-on physical fighter who could wield the most weapons and armor but cannot use magic. Fighter is your martial arts / monk type who fights best without weapons, but they can also use claws, which are technically weapons. Whatever, I don't get it. Wizards are potent magic users of the offensive variety who are poor melee fighters otherwise. Pilgrims, aka priests, are your healers who can at least swing a sword around. Merchants appraise merchandise. And finally there's the Goof-Off, an uncontrollable NPC who does whatever they want, and your only hope is that they do something remotely useful as it relates to the battle. They're more of a handicap than anything, but you'll want one along for the ride eventually, for reasons we'll get into later down the road. Also in this pub, den, whatever, is the vault, where you can bank any money you've accumulated or any items you no longer need in order to free up space in your item slots. Because you see, each character can only carry 8 items at any time, and this includes any weapons, armors, and other accessories you may have equipped or acquired. The addition of a vault is a welcome one, because you can now offload all those key items you don't need anymore, and are only taking up space that could be better served, and money can also be stored so that you have something in the bank, should you see an unfortunate demise that costs half your golden hand. Also new to the game is a day-night mechanic where time passes as you venture out in the overworld and it gradually shifts from day to night and vice versa. Naturally, the fiercer monsters come out at night, or so I'm told at least. But visiting locales at night usually entail different happenings. Most shops are closed, most people are asleep, and other stuff will happen, I guess. It's a fairly basic mechanic and time freezes whenever you visit a town, dungeon, or what have you, but it does add texture to the game and it also plays a part in the overall story, or at least a part of the story at least. From there, the gameplay is pretty much the same as before. You roam around this massive world fighting monsters, looting treasure, gaining experience points to build up your stats and also your spell list, as well as gold to purchase your wares. Sometimes enemies will drop items that you could add to your inventory, assuming you could carry more stuff, of course, otherwise it's discarded, we will never speak of this again, that sort of thing. The grind for experience isn't any better than before, and something that even the later Switch remake failed to really expedite. I suppose 3 games in you start to feel it grating a bit and kinda sorta wish this wouldn't last as long, or drag as long, or whatever the word you want to use. Most of the time was spent randomly fighting tough monsters for pitiful returns, and eventually it got to the point where I just went, fuck it, busted out a Game Genie, put in a code for one-hit kills, and just roamed around a big patch of land with big bad monsters to get the big earnings quickly. This didn't last the whole game, I went through it, most of it playing honestly at least, but sometimes you just get to a point where you're just too old for this shit. You start off on a rather smallish island continent where everyone speaks remotely modern English. Well, that's a bit of a disappointment, but it was bound to happen sooner or later. And then using the power of warp technology, you eventually come across a much larger continent with more places to visit. And by the time you get the boat to sail the seas, well, there's even more places for you to visit. One such place is the Shrine of Dhamma, or the All Trades of Abbey, or whatever you want to call it, whatever the 100 names they call it in these versions. Which is where you can change the class of one of your allies once they've surpassed level 20. So if you want to turn one of your wizards into a soldier, or vice versa, you can do that. The class change carries over certain aspects from one class to another. Whatever spells you've learned are retained in the changeover, for example. But the caveat is that with a new class change comes a fresh start, so you're bumped back to level 1. Shouldn't take too long to get back on track with all the experience and stuff, but then again... You can't change the hero's class because why wouldn't you want to be a hero? There's a variety of reasons, but I digress. If you have a goof-off on your team and they somehow survived long enough to make it to level 20, they'll have the options to change their class to a sage, which is a combination wizard, cleric, priest type who can learn all the spells and then some. Anyone else will need the Book of Satori to achieve this changeover, and there's only one such book apparently. I guess that must not have been a bestseller. There's also the side plot of an old man's dream of building a new town, which requires the player to sacrifice a merchant to help out this old man, and over time you get to see the development of this fine city. Any merchant will do, you can just create one at the pub for the express purpose of developing this new town. Though strangely, if you give up a lady merchant, she becomes a he for the rest of the game, making this one of the earliest transitions in video games. I'm sure that's relevant to someone out there somewhere. I'm moving on. Much like the previous game, you have multiple points to save your progress, but unlike the previous game, using a return spell or a wyvern ring will give you a list of previously visited locations that you could warp back to, which makes traveling this world much more manageable than going the long way round or using warp points to take you to who knows where. There are some places, however, that you do need to make your way back on foot, and the same can be said for the next game, but still a partial list is better than no list. One of these towns even have a master arena that you could bet on. Good luck with that. And one of these towns also has less than reputable salesmen in the local market. There is definitely flavor and texture in this world. The towns and castles you visit have their own distinct vibe and personality to them. But ultimately, they're just stopovers and your ultimate goal to defeat the big bad Baramos, and once that's done, the day is saved, right? Right? Well, not quite. And this is where I should probably add a spoiler warning of sorts, but let's be real. You were spoiled the instant you read the back of the box, which advertised Dragon Warrior 3 as the beginning of the Erdrick legend that the first 2 games depicted. And yes, this is indeed a prequel to those first 2 games, in that this is the story of the hero character who came to the land of Alefgard, a world shrouded in perpetual darkness when you first arrive, and defeated a great evil using a ball of light that you got from this here dragon in the main world. What was legend in Dragon Warrior the First encompasses the final third of this 3rd game. Alefgard is its own world separate from the rest of the game, an earlier version of the world your descendant would travel to, complete with towns that were featured in that game in some form or another, as well as a couple other places long since vanished from the annals of time. In some ways, this would have been a nice little Easter egg, and in a way, it's the closest thing to a second quest that you're going to get with these games at the time, outside of subsequent remakes that would add what I feel is needless post-game content. For what it's worth, this is a step above revisiting the land in Dragon Warrior 2, where it was depicted as a much smaller land of relative insignificance in the larger scheme of things. And if I'm being bold, Dragon Warrior 3 does the prequel thing better than other third games of the time like Castlevania 3 or A Link to the Past, which easily could have been slotted anywhere. I mean, Dracula's Curse could easily have been another adventure of Simon Belmont rather than that of Trevor Belmont, and people used to refer to A Link to the Past as Zelda 3 as though it was a sequel to the two NES games rather than a prequel. Not that it really would have mattered anyway. Dragon Warrior 3 retells the story of something that was alluded to in the first game, and being able to play that story out is pretty neat. And the road to get there was a nice build as well. That last third would have been a nice surprise for the player if it hadn't been spoiled in the back of the fucking box, you fucking... Dragon Warrior 3 maintains a similar visual style to the previous two games, and that's okay. There's only so much you could do in touching up this style of visual on the NES. Such as figuring out how to make full-size castle exteriors instead of just slapping the overworld castle tile in your town map, which is what they do here, and it looks really, really bad. Like embarrassingly bad. Like they couldn't even be bothered to color in the pink background on it so it at least blends with the rest of the map. Coincidentally, this is not an issue with castles in the overworld map, but yeah, this is just sad. Besides that though, the tiles look different and distinct as do the various caves you travel in. There's more attempts to give the various kingdoms and towns more of a unique identity such as it is. On a whole, the traditional overhead graphics look fine, not a huge step from what came before, but different. The only real new effect is the day-night transitions, which is nice and casual with the passage of time. Once again, battles are depicted in a black void, and while there's some character art that's been recycled from previous games, there's a whole slew of monsters to fend off against, and they look fine. Beyond that, the game maintains its fairly simplistic presentation, looks fine, but you'll be better served elsewhere if you want something more elaborate looking. Whatever that actually entails and this sort of thing. Unfortunately, the old-timey medieval English, which was a highlight in the previous two games, have been mostly excised from this localization. Everyone speaks proper modern English, which is nowhere near as fun or amusing, but at least it's well written, so that's something, I suppose. One thing worth mentioning is the little opening cutscene that plays after the title screen if you don't press anything, which apparently wasn't part of the original Famicom version and thus made especially for the NES release. Didn't expect something like this on here to pop up, but I actually dig this nice little attract sequence, if you will. Simple but effective in providing the very bare-bones backstory in this opening chapter of the game. In the sound department, well, a lot of the sound effects used in the previous game are reused here, but there's some new ones as well. Still, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, I suppose. The soundtrack, on the other hand, continues to up its game. A fairly heroic-sounding overworld theme to serenade you on your journeys, a majestic castle theme, a rather jaunty town theme, some other moody themes in other locations. Definitely a step above what came before and a natural evolution of the music in the series. And when you eventually get to that world of darkness, a much somber version of the first game's overworld theme plays, somewhat mirroring the dreary nature of the world you're traveling in. This is the only theme from the first game that gets reused besides the traditional Dragon Quest theme and some other jingles. Subsequent remakes would reuse more of the first game's soundtrack, but here on the NES, they just reuse the same themes from the rest of the game's locations for the towns and such. Regardless, there's some good music on here and a step up from what came before. Dragon Warrior 3 is the beloved entry of the bunch, I'm told. It has to be, considering it's getting one of those fancy HD 2D remake things or whatever it's supposed to be called. That's still even a thing, apparently. And people consider this to be the best of the 8-bit entries. I don't know, would I really go that far? As a game, it's an improvement over the previous two. The quest feels much grander, and that back-of-the-box spoiling twist certainly gives the plot a bit more depth. And also, this game doesn't have a weird automated feature that would get introduced in the next game, so the battles play out better. You can create your own party and cast of characters. I'd almost consider this the NX equivalent of the first Final Fantasy game, except this game isn't total shit. To many people, number 3 is the formula's finest form. It doesn't get any better than this within the constraints of the 8-bit output. But to me, it's just an evolution of what came before. A grand adventure indeed, but it's not what I would call the most fulfilling. And honestly, I couldn't even begin to tell you why. Maybe it's due to a lack of personal investment or childhood/nostalgic association that I had with the first 2 games, that lack of wonder that made revisiting those games special in spite of their antiquated quirks. Maybe it was the endless grinds finally starting to catch up and actually being really bad enough that I had to resort to illicit means to get through it quicker. Or maybe it was just the reality that I was playing this game mostly out of personal obligation so I could get out of the way before touching on the game that I really wanted to talk about. Now, I'm not saying that Dragon Warrior 3 is a bad game, because it really isn't. On the contrary, out of the 4 NES entries, number 3 is probably the one I found to be the most accessible to the newbie player looking to dabble into the series' 8-bit origins for whatever reason. The remakes are much more forgiving and quality of life-ish. But if you were going to dive into one of these games on the old Nintendo, the third game is probably the best starting point, and from there, it's open season. And for what it's worth, I did enjoy my time with Dragon Warrior 3, at least when progress was being made. And that last stretch in the World of Darkness was probably the most enjoyable part of the game for me, in part because it's basically the only portion of the game that could be considered a prequel and backstory to that first Dragon Warrior/Dragon Quest title, and playing that backstory out is pretty neat to me at least. But when all was said and done, Dragon Warrior 3 was a game that I missed out on all those years, never got to play until recently, and now that I did, well, I could scratch that off the list and move on to something else, and that's what I did. I haven't even touched the Switch remake in a good long while, and I'm not particularly excited about that other remake due down the road. Great game in the series, a substantial evolution of the formula, and a favorite of many I'm sure, but a title that didn't leave much of an impression with me, and that's really all I've got to say about Dragon Warrior 3.